Okay, welcome to the next session for our Catalyst Day presentations. And the particular group that is presenting now, the title of their talk is The Black Snake, Oil Pipelines on Native American Land. And the presenters are Cameron Zimmerman, Tyler Benish, Jasmine Jacobson, Theron Schindler, and Paige Smith.
Okay, so are we good to start? All right. Like Dr. Byron said, our project is the Black Snake, which focuses on environmental justice of pipelines built on Native American lands. Since World War II, many Native American reservations have been infested and subjected to easement of lands by oil companies. Pipelines built in this era weren't exactly built with super great safety precautions, and there was not a safety administration to monitor the builds of these until November 30th, 2004, when the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration was established. Building of these oil pipelines subjects the natives who live on these lands to have to deal with the devastating oil spills and toxic chemicals spewed out of the pipelines and into the land they inhabit. 70% of the oil carried by these pipelines is crude oil, which contains a chemical known as sulfur. Sulfur is a very harsh-smelling chemical and in large amounts is very poisonous and lethal when ingested. Considering most native tribes and citizens live off the land, you can see why this is very dangerous. Some tribes that face these issues and caught our attention were the Bad River Tribe and Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. The Bad River Tribe has been oppressed by Enbridge and their Line 5 pipeline, and the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe has had complications with the Keystone XL pipeline. We picked these two tribes because one is close to home and it's relatable, and the other faces a larger issue that's been going on for a longer time and serves as a point of relevance to anyone outside of Wisconsin. These pictures show the Enbridge Line 5 and the lands it crosses, much of which is very natural landscape and bountiful in nature, but most importantly crosses through the Bad River Tribe's land. Moving on to some spill numbers. There are over 2 million miles worth of pipeline in the US, and that's enough to wrap the Earth 80 times. And in 2020, the Sierra Club reported that several massive pipelines slash across the entire state of Wisconsin and pump more than 1.2 million barrels a day, over 1,000 miles, representing 20% of all US crude oil imports. Pipelines have spilled over 34 million gallons of hazardous liquids in the United States, stated by Diana Beth. And in 1968, since 1968, there have been 7,978 pipeline incidents, an average of about 235 a year, reported by Richard Stover. On July 25th, 2010, Enbridge Pipeline 6B ruptured and spilled approximately 843,000 gallons of Canadian tar sands crude oil. The effects of this oil spill are still felt years later by the people of Marshall, Michigan. This spill entered the Kalamazoo River and traveled 40 miles downstream, creating a shutdown of the river and use of its water features for nearly 2 years. This shows why the worry of the Bad River Tribe is legitimate, because Enbridge has had problems with spills in the past. This blue graph shows the increase of oil spills exceeding 50 barrels from 1970 to 2005. And in 2005, there were over 20 instances in which there were oil spills that exceeded 50 barrels of oil. Each barrel contains 42 gallons of liquid oil, surmounting to over 2,100 gallons spilled on 20 separate occasions. This red graph shows the relative increase of spills from the 1900s to present, with the most coming around the present from 2010 to 2019. And from 2010 to 2019, there were about 900 different liquid line incidents from the US, reported by Matt Kelso. Economically, not only are these big oil companies trashing the world we live in, they are spending millions of dollars in reparations and cleanup costs when there is a spill. And on average, it costs $283 to clean up 1 gallon of oil, and over $1 billion are spent every year to clean up these catastrophes. In 2010 alone, over $3.7 billion were spent to clean up oil spills in the US. The oil spill by Enbridge Line B6 in 2010 had cleanup costs of $230 million, and they also tried to pay $61 million in compensation to the Bad River Tribe, which was ultimately turned down due to feelings that it was pity money. And then Enbridge used $110 million to repair Line B6 and its 6-foot wide rupture, which they ultimately had to replace the whole line, which cost them $1.6 billion, according to Hasemeyer in 2017. So needless to say, these pipelines and spills are very expensive, not to mention the money it costs the area around the spill. Moving on to the violation of rights. Until recently, Native voices opposing these builds of the pipelines have not been heard, and they've been having their rights violated for centuries. Builds of these pipelines violated the Dawes Act of 1887, also referred to as the General Allotment Act, which gave the tribes between 80 and 160 acres of land to govern on their own. As time went on, the number of acres they got dwindled down to almost nothing. This act is closely related to tribal sovereignty because it grants them land in which they are free to govern in the ways they want. The building and spilling of oil pipelines also interfere with their constitutional right to assemble. Natives are also very known for their powwows, where they gather and enjoy festivities such as song, dance, and feast, and they use these powwows as a form of work. In 1921, at Stand Rock in Wisconsin Dells, more than 150 natives held a powwow here, and tourists were very welcome for admission cost of $1.15, and that's about $15.25 in today's standards. Thus, oil spills here drive away tourism and degrade their right to earn a wage in assembly, where they were able to enjoy the fruits to their labor. These dastardly builds and spills also interfere with their right to identity and life. Oil spills alter their way of life established by their ancestors for centuries. Their way of life is their culture and identity, and the right to a personal or cultural identity begins with the right to life, which all human beings are entitled to. The idea of personality and identity singular to an individual have been around and preserved in cultures since the birth of human rights. Included in their culture is their right to freedom of religion and to practice their religion. Oil spills may drive them out of the land that they inhabit, which has a very large spiritual inheritance that is important to them in their culture and practicing their religion that has been a staple to their identity for generations. Now moving on to some existing solutions. The first is above ground transportation, such as trains, trucks, and tankers. The problem with these is that they are not as quick and effective at moving oil as pipelines and create a much larger carbon footprint. They do, however, create more jobs. Followed by that are pipeline pigs. These devices are placed inside oil pipelines that help move oil back and forth, as well as keep the pipelines clean. Next, the DNR is the source that maintains a balance and relationship between many native tribes and can help voice their concerns. Lastly, nuclear power is an alternative fuel source, not moved by a pipeline, so less chance of spill. However, the negative side effects such as radiation are too much of a risk to use this. And after hearing all that and doing our research, our applied innovation is to propose a government bill to regulate the use of oil pipelines on Native American lands, including a government agency to mandate the use of oil and switch for an alternative fuel source monitored by the TRC. We'd also like the pipeline pigs and DNR to be incorporated to generate a public report of the condition of the pipelines. Jasmine will walk you more through the TRC.
One component of our applied innovation is the implementation of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, or TRCs for short. This will allow Native American voices to be heard and their concerns addressed in regards to violations of their rights and dangers to their lands. TRCs focus on restorative justice, finding a way for those involved to resolve conflict in a meaningful and healing manner. In definition, a TRC is an official body tasked with investigating and revealing wrongdoing by a government, company, or other party, and repairing relations. TRCs have been used in the past in South Africa after apartheid and in Canada to make reparations for Indigenous communities wronged by assimilation by the church. While those examples were on a larger national scale, these TRCs for our innovation will be created on a state level for communities as they are needed. In the creation process, Native communities would be consulted on their views of justice and representation. Something similar has been done in Maine previously, where monetary reparations were made for colonial wrongdoings against Indigenous populations. Our innovation would also allow Native communities to choose a sponsor for the commission that will assist in investigating rights violations, give funding and resources, and allocate skilled workers to help with investigations and forming a report that is then released to the public. While in turn, that will help dictate what reparations and legal action need to be pursued. And an example of a potential sponsor is the PILPG, or Public International Law and Policy Group, which is a nonprofit global law firm that provides legal assistance to states, governments, and other groups working on peace agreements, and they have written extensively on TRCs. The next portion of our applied innovation is government agency.
Right now, there's a bill being proposed that would stop oil companies from using tax loopholes that they are using right now to line their pockets with money. This money needs to be spent advancing the technology used in renewable energy. We believe that this is a great first step, but it's not enough. So one part of our applied innovation is to introduce a new government agency that will enforce more regulation on oil companies because we have found that they have too much freedom and nobody's keeping them in check. We would loosely base this new government agency off of the EPA. And the EPA right now is they create specific criteria when it comes to car manufacturers to make them environmentally friendly. So they create guidelines that every car manufacturer has to meet in order to produce their car. And this agency updates every year the new guidelines, so that it is ever changing. And then we believe California will be the first state to help back us in this because California is very environmentally friendly and they want to be using completely renewable energy by 2035. So with our applied innovation, this would help California reach that goal. So we would be proposing that oil companies switch to biobutanol, which is an alternative fuel source that is very safe and is also renewable. Biobutanol is a butyl alcohol that can be derived from different types of waste, such as coffee silver skin, corn grains, and other biomass. This process to make biobutanol is a 72-hour fermentation process, and the major reagent used is water. This is unlike other processes that require mining and output dangerous gases into the atmosphere. Compared to other forms of energy, the cost to make is fairly low. The biggest con to this process is that it is not yet fully developed. Once this is perfected, it will be the optimal way to produce energy. If biobutanol is used instead of oil, the old pipelines can still be used to transport the biobutanol. Since biobutanol cannot be mixed with water, it is easy on the environment, and spills would be extremely less worrisome. Coffee silver skin can be used as a fertilizer if a spill would happen. It is estimated that the oil will be scarce within 60 years. Because of this, it would be beneficial for oil companies to start to change into other sources if they want the business to survive. The first step into making this process happen is to draft a bill to be proposed. Once we have this, we will need to find a legislator to sponsor our bill to a committee to study and review our bill. After this, we will need the bill to run the gauntlet of Congress and receive 2/3 vote from the House of Representatives and Senate. Once we get the required amount of votes, then the president has to sign the bill. The next step would be to find donors of biomass. This would be coffee houses, restaurants, and other places that produce waste that we can use. Energy companies would be told that they must start making the switch to B20 or biobutanol, much like the EPA does to fuel efficiency and carbon emissions. We will do that to the energy companies. They will be required to get in contact with biobutanol producers and start working on a referendum or a deal to stop obtaining the B20. As for the TLC, we would need to find a group of qualified individuals willing to inform Wisconsinites and people across the nation and how the IRS affects Native Americans. So the next slide is funding. We plan on using donations, not monetarily, but actually by waste. We want to use the use of leftover grains in the grounds that can be turned into B20. So we would ask companies such as Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, and other places to donate the leftover coffee grounds to produce biobutanol in exchange for a royalty from the fuel produced and sold. Truth commissions are funded via sponsorships by non-governmental organizations who can remain impartial to various parties and may be involved. One such potential sponsor is the Public Internal Law and Policy Group, a nonprofit organization that acts as a global law firm providing free legal assistance to states, governments, and other groups working on a peace agreement. So some major stakeholders would of course be the government officials who need to pass the bill and vote it. And then the coffee companies who would we be using their leftover grounds to produce the B20. The energy companies that have to switch the way they're doing business completely and start using renewable resources, B20. And then the Native Americans who can get their voice heard and make their lands safer for them.
There are some potential barriers that could prevent us from reaching our goal. If we were not to find a member of Congress to be a sponsor of the bill, we won't be able to get it into Congress to go through the gauntlet. Another barrier would be if we did get through the gauntlet and the president were to veto the bill. Another area that will be very important to get set in stone would be have donors. Even though there is a plan to have donations with their leftover waste material from companies like Starbucks, it might not work out as they do have the right not to supply their materials. The last barrier that we would need to break down would be the oil companies. They need to realize that even though they are making huge profits off their oil, it will eventually run out. They need to start changing to different types of fuel sources to run through their pipes to still stay in business. Down the line, their profit will be substantially more than what the profits are for fossil fuels. Okay, so if everything were to go as planned and we broke through all of the barriers, our solution will work for everyone. With the biobutanol, we can use the fuel to have the same effect as normal fossil fuels have without the pollution being released in the air. Even if there is a spill with the biobutanol from the pipelines, it won't harm the environment around it, including the plants and animals. Biobutanol will not only benefit our environment, but the oil companies will be profiting much more than what they are with the original fossil fuels. Also, oil will still have its purpose when everything switches. The changing of the fuels will help save the oil of what is left, and most of all, the TRC rights will not be as violated as many times as where they are now. So here's how we plan to start making changes and implementing our plan in a general sense. Our first year, we would be to find our sponsor and bring the bill to Congress and draft the bill itself. By the second year, we hope to have the bill passed, and in the third year, starting putting into legislation into effect. After the bill has been passed, then we can start bringing the physical changes into play. The areas that we would be changing would be the biobutanol going through the pipelines, getting the different materials from these companies such as Starbucks to be able to have a system to bring the biomass to the oil companies. There will be changes that we will have to make up along the process as things tend to change as time goes on. It will also take time to meet with oil companies to bring our case to the table to persuade switching their product, and the changes will be gradual as it is hard to change everything in such a short period of time. Next slide.
Any questions? I saw some in the chat, but haven't had a chance to look at those real quick.
First question in chat is, in 2019, Enbridge had revenue of over $50 billion and received federal tax subsidies. In the current administration, environmental regulations were reduced for oil and gas companies. Do you think tax subsidies should be eliminated and more regulations should be enacted?
Yes, we do believe that because right now there's over 12 tax loopholes that oil companies are using. And so this an oil company are just major multi-billion-dollar businesses already. So the fact that they're still using tax loopholes to make even more money for them is outrageous in our minds.
Paige, can you unshare so we could see your whole group for the questions?
And the second question is there any sense of how companies could create enough biobutanol to equate what we use in oil currently? Seems unlikely that the sources you're mentioning, Starbucks, et cetera, could do this.
I kind of have a couple of like answers to that. So there's a lot of different materials that can actually make the biobutanol. Of course, we have all of the coffee grounds, which Starbucks actually goes. I don't have I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head quite a bit, but other sources like corn, wheat, and even products of making beer and other alcoholic beverages used to make this, so it's more than just the coffee grounds. So there is going to be of stuff to use to make the fuel, but also the can be mixed with oil and gasoline. It just won't be as strong if they choose to mix it with it.
Yeah, essentially, biobutanol is made from the same feedstocks that is used to make ethanol. And so if you just use what you would make ethanol usually out of, you could make a biobutanol.
Next question, are pipelines overrepresented on Native American lands relative to the total lands in the US?
They are, recently it's been an issue that you've seen a lot about. From our research, they are not overrepresented. It's actually about equal. However, most of these tribes and their way of life are underrepresented by these oil pipelines and their companies because they live off the land, whereas pipelines that cross through major cities and such aren't as worried about the environmental impact and their changing of lives if there were to be an oil spill on their land.
It's a question from Professor Nygaard. Thank you for tackling such an important topic. Is biobutanol something that could be used in conjunction with things like ethanol, methane captured from landfills, etc.? Or is it intended to replace those types of similar strategies?
It could definitely be both. Like I said, you can mix the two together. Otherwise, it could completely take over the other types of fuel if that's what the companies wanted to do.
Yeah, our innovation is to push for gradual implementation of biobutanol, eventually replacing, gradually mixed it first, and then eventually having biobutanol as the replacement for fossil fuel.
Next question, as mentioned, is Cameron. Says, I believe you mentioned legislation passed in the 2000s. I was wondering what you all think caused the passing of this legislation. Do you think protests have helped pass legislation?
So yeah, initially we didn't really know what it was, but if you go back through the presentation, the blue graph that I mentioned about the oil spills exceeding 50 barrels of oil, in 2004, when the legislative bill was passed, you can see that there was an increase in the amount of oil being spilled, which would lead to an increase in protests and people voicing their concerns, which ultimately would lead to some safety administration being established in any case, whether it's oil or not. The lands were being damaged and they were spending millions and billions of dollars on cleanup costs that weren't necessarily necessary because there were no safety administration safety administrations at the time.
There's another question in chat about if the same processes are used for biobutanol as ethanol, why not just increase ethanol production from the new sources like Starbucks?
So ethanol, as it is currently used, is already mixed with gasoline, I'm pretty sure. And biobutanol is just a cleaner fuel source. Ethanol still gives off emissions that biobutanol is better.
I have a question about how do you create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? How does that get created, and who, do they have punitive power?
So what they do is they have their mission is basically to investigate rights in the first place and try and resolve conflict between both parties. It usually involves like reparations of some sort, not necessarily punitive action. But the creation basically it's just a collaboration between various government sections, like if state government and the communities themselves, sponsors, sometimes social workers are needed. But usually there's drafted up a legislation for what they will be investigating and what their job is.
Okay. If there are no further questions, we'll conclude this session and join folks at the next one. Thank you very much.